Oh, he can Game of Thrones, 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 can Game of Thrones.
I can't. What are you doing tonight?
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones.
Well, I got the perfect show just for you to watch.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of
It's
Thrones.
packed full of lots of sex with prostitutes.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game
And a
of Thrones.
dwarf that always gets on the fucking piss.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of
Some
Thrones.
slut gave birth to 3 dragons.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of
She
Thrones.
always gets her tits out for the boys.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game
Some
of Thrones.
dickheads up north that protect a wall keep saying that winter is coming.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones.
They don't realize they live in the snow, so it's winter all year round.
Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of
Dumb
Thrones, can.
cunts.
Oh, he can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones, can Game of Thrones.